So what I'd like to talk about is using the Wolfram language to help with astrophotography and other astronomy-related topics. I like to go out in my backyard and take pictures of astronomical objects, and then sit down late in the evening and process the stuff to get some decent-looking images. The nice thing about Mathematica is it has all sorts of advanced image processing techniques, plus reams of data, which is useful for astronomical work. And it also has interfacing features, so you can interface Mathematica directly with your equipment. So let's talk a little bit about some of the import and export features of Mathematica. Astronomy generates a lot of data, at least astrophotography does. And Mathematica is great because it can bring all that stuff easily into our computational environment. Mathematica has facilities for bringing in FITS files. These are flexible image transport system files, which are the preferred media for astronomical data. And this is scientific data plus lots of metadata, which contains information about the observation and the equipment. You can also bring in conventional images like JPEGs and RAW images and PNG images, as well as video data, which will be important for certain types of imaging. And we can import video data directly into a notebook as a video object now. So the thing I like to do is to take astronomical images, and there's certain workflows that you need to adhere to in order to get a decent image of what you're looking at. Astronomical objects are either fall, it seems, into one of two classes. They're either extremely dim and extremely large, or extremely small and extremely bright. And I'm going to talk about techniques for dealing with both of these cases. When we're talking about the dim and faint objects, we're mostly concerned with eliminating noise. And there's different techniques which you can implement in Mathematica for dealing with this. And so we're going to talk about something called calibration, which is the process of taking your images and reducing noise and increasing the signal by subtracting out noise, which you can collect through different techniques. You can align and stack images, and this uses statistical means to reduce noise, because noise by definition is random and it will average out, increasing the signal to noise ratio again. You can also stretch an image, which means you can basically plot a histogram of the intensities of that image, and then find the section that you're interested in and stretch that out so that that part of the signal encompasses the full data range of your images. And there's other techniques too, which we won't go into so much in this talk, but we will in the future, like synthesizing images, in other words, creating false color images, using color channels that are not necessarily red, green, and blue, but they may be narrowband channels, so you can emphasize things like the prevalence of doubly ionized oxygen in a nebula, and also plotting spectroscopic data. So let's talk a little bit about image calibration. And when you take an astronomical image, in the old days, you used to put a big plate on the back of the telescope and just give it a long exposure. And this was a tricky thing to do because the telescope had to be pointing very accurately for a long period of time. We don't do that anymore. The final image is actually built out of a bunch of subframes. And each one might be like a minute long. So that reduces the burden on whatever tracking techniques you're using. And by adding up a series of these subframes, you can increase the signal to noise ratio, because the noise will generally average out. So in addition to these which are called light frames, you have to take some additional frames to help with the image calibration. And these frames don't capture the image, but they do capture the noise. And there's basically three types of them. There's something called a dark frame, and these are taken the same length as your light frames, and the camera needs to be at the same temperature as the light frames, but with the camera lens covered, or the telescope lens covered. And what this does is it measures the amount of noise generated by the heat of the electronics inside your camera. And this is a significant thing. Even regular DSLRs do this automatically. You may not realize it, but we take them explicitly to subtract them out. There's something called a bias frame. It turns out the actual process of reading out the CCD wells in your camera has uncertainty associated with it. And these bias frames, which are extremely short, so they don't have any thermal noise, just contain the this offset, this noise associated with the read. And then there's a third type of frame called a flat frame. And these are taken with the aperture uncovered and pointed at a neutral, evenly illuminated surface, like for instance, the morning sky or the evening sky. And sometimes you put a cloth over the telescope to further even it out. And the reason why we do this is to measure the light fall off on your sensor. Large sensors, especially those in like digital SLRs, there's noticeable light fall off towards the edges, and you have to be able to multiply that out. This also takes care of artifacts in your optical train, like dust on the sensor. You'll identify this, and that will get subtracted out. And here is a brief description. The raw frame, you subtract out the master bias and the master dark frames, and you divide out by the master flat, and you get a calibrated frame. And then you can take those and you can stack them to further reduce noise. So let's give an example of this deep sky imaging calibration workflow. So here I imaged M27, the Dumbbell Nebula, with a small telescope, an 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain, and a Canon DSLR camera, and this was done in my backyard in downtown Urbana, Illinois, in July. So in this example, I separately processed the offset and the dark frames. So I'm importing them. You can see master bias and master dark. And then I form a list of the light frames. These are the actual exposures. So I'm just bringing in the names of these frames right now. The reason why I don't immediately bring the entire set into memory is because they're extremely large. They're high resolution and they're in raw format, so there's no compression whatsoever. So each one is probably at least 25 megabytes of data. So for this example, we're just going to use 7. So I'm going to take 7 out of my list of file names, and I'm going to import them all. Okay, so now we're going to use the functional programming features of Mathematica to take the list of light frames and subtract off that bias, master bias frame. That will take off the offset and the read noise. And then we're going to take off the thermal noise by subtracting out the master dark frame. And we're reusing the list of lights here, so we don't consume additional memory. And then we're going to use the built-in image alignment features in Mathematica, which are extremely sophisticated, to bring all the frames into perfect alignment, because there may be slight drifting because the telescope isn't exactly pointed at the polar axis. And finally, we're going to use image exposure combined to build the final image out of the collection of calibrated light frames. And then the last thing we do is we take a histogram of M27 and we stretch the interesting data part from about 0.1 to 0.3, so it covers the entire data range. And this is what it looks like. So this is the Dumbbell Nebula. The image is a little noisy because you know, we only use 7 frames. But if I had spent a longer period of time, the noise would go down and the interesting parts of the image would pop up. And finally, oh, let's go back here. If you have a good eye, you can see that I didn't use any flat frames in this example. And you can see that the image is noticeably darker in the corners here of the image than it is right in the center. And that's that light fall off I was talking about, because the sensor on the camera is pretty big compared to the illumination disk of the telescope. And some people fix this with additional optics to flatten stuff out. We're just going to use software that we have. Okay. Also, you can see artifacts on the sensor. Luckily, Mathematica has a great function for doing this, and we're not going to use any of its sophisticated features here. We're just going to throw the image right into it and say, do brightness equalize. And it pretty well flattens out the image. Of course, it doesn't take care of the dust artifacts. For that, you really need to have flat frames. So that future examples will have that sort of thing. So that's an example of the deep sky imaging workflow. Again, a very dim object that you need to do a lot of noise reduction to see properly. Now we're going to move on to planetary imaging. This is completely the opposite. These are planets tend to be very small and very bright compared to nebula and clusters. So you need different imaging techniques. The first thing you need to do is you need to get much more magnification. So your optical train will probably include stuff like Barlow lens or maybe eyepiece projection. And one of the examples here will be using eyepiece projection to magnify Mars, which is notoriously difficult to image because it's very small. So to give you an idea of this difference in scale, we can compare the size of the moon to the size of the Andromeda galaxy. The moon is about 30 arc minutes in diameter. Even though it looks big in the sky, it's only half a degree in size. For instance, the Andromeda galaxy, even though it's much, much dimmer, is 6 times as large. And you can see it with your naked eye in a summer evening. You can see it, go out and just look in the sky, and you can see a little fuzzy patch there. That's not the entire galaxy. That's just the core of the galaxy you're seeing. You need a long exposure to bring out the full galaxy. So for planetary imaging, what we're going to do is we're going to try to suck as many images into the telescope as possible and align them and stack them all. This will even out the noise, and it will also even out a problem that since we're using high magnification, the image is probably going to be dancing around a lot. So the ideal way to bring that sort of data into Mathematica is with a video clip. The good things about planetary imaging, it doesn't require careful alignment of the telescope because the alignment technique kind of takes care of this. So you don't even need to set up your star tracking, your closed loop guiding. Drift effects, as long as they don't, are terrible, they will be canceled out. You don't need to take a number of exposures to get a large object like the Andromeda galaxy. You can get it all in one shot. Noise isn't much of a problem because you're stacking many, many images. And the equipment is also very modest. This is just a regular webcam that I modified to use as an astronomical camera. So I use this very camera here to take some pictures of Mars. So bring in hundreds of images. If you want, you can subtract out a dark frame for each of the images and use our image morphology routines to determine the centroid of the circular image or centroid of the planet and align all the images based on that centroid. And then you combine the images using statistical functions. So to show what this can do, we're going to look at really horrible data. And I have to admit that this is not the best image of Mars that you're ever going to see. By the way, Mars is very close next week or so, so I would invite all of you to go outside around 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock and take a look at it. But so for this one, I've imported this WebM video right into Mathematica, and hopefully everyone will be able to see it here. So this is the product of my great efforts. You can see it's just bouncing around. It's a blob. You can't really tell what it is. You can start to bring up some features, like there's a polar cap there, and these are some of the dark features across the disk of Mars. And that's what I have to work with, which isn't much, but we can get something out of it. So I did go over this a couple of years ago, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail. The notebook will be available. Basically, this determines what the centroid of the planet's disk is, and then it moves that into the center of the image, and then finally, it aligns all the subframes in the video from that centroid, and then it does a median on all of them. So this is, here I've imported every single video frame from the Mars video, and there's probably a few hundred frames in this. And I call that routine, which I just wrote there, and this is the result. It's not great, but you can start to bring out some details and such. And if I had taken the time and waited until Mars was a little bit higher in the sky, I think we would have gotten a little better results. And I'm going to try to do that maybe tonight or tomorrow to see, and maybe you'll see the results next year. You can also do this with things that are not disks, like for instance, taking pictures of the moon. This is, again, which was taken with a webcam and the 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain. This is a video taken from my front yard at the moon, and it's just a close-up of one of the lunar craters, Clavius. So it's just a WebM file captured on Linux using the Cheese application, and we bring it right into Mathematica, and we take the first frame to be the key frame, and we align all the images with the key frame. And I think this is actually not even necessary. We can just call image align on the whole list, and it will just take the first frame. And then I wrote a routine. This is one of the older routines I wrote, but it uses parallel processing to speed things up. And it does a median of the color images. And this is the result. This is a close-up of the crater Clavius. These black bars are an artifact of the stacking routine, but we can crop those out. And then the last thing I like to do is do a deconvolution on it using our deconvolution routines and I'm guessing that the point spread function is like a 5x5 Gaussian matrix. And so that sharpened it up pretty good. And that's just a quick webcam image of Clavius there. And you don't even need to have that sort of sophisticated equipment. Just an iPhone held up to the eyepiece will work in a lot of cases with a little bit of help from Mathematica. This is an image taken of the sun during the last transit of Venus. There's Venus right there. Here's the disk of the sun. This was taken with a different telescope with a filter on the front. But I still used image deconvolution to sharpen things up, and I did a slight automatic stretching on the thing. These are sunspots approximately the size of the Earth, and this was taken just after Venus entered the solar disk at the last transit. Now, let's see, when was that last transit? I don't remember. Let's see. The last transit was on June 5th of 2012. And as you can see here, Venus entered the solar disk right around 5:39 p.m. Central Time. So that picture was taken a little bit later. It wasn't 7 o'clock, but it was probably closer to 6 o'clock. And I took that out at Parkland College. And so this sort of data is a good example of the type of data that you can get, just with a natural language query right in Mathematica. This is another example. This is a little better data here, and it shows what you can do. This is 289 images. Now, this wasn't a video clip. This was just a 289 small still images taken with a different astronomical camera. This was a cooled camera, so there's less noise associated with it. But once I calculated the centroid and aligned all the images and did a mild deconvolution, I got a pretty detailed picture of the cloud structure on Jupiter. So what I've been talking to you up to now is about basically creating nice pictures with Mathematica of astronomical objects, but you can actually use rather modest equipment and techniques to actually get interesting scientific data out of your amateur astronomy endeavors. And this, I talked about this last year. I'm going to briefly cover it again. I won't go into full detail, but this sort of thing can be used to get interesting and important data. For instance, a light curve of a variable star, which can give us clues to how far away it is and its intrinsic brightness. It can also be used to determine things like planetary crossings. You can discover exoplanets using this technique. So this is a useful, serious astronomical technique, and it's not just limited to professional astronomers. A lot of amateurs like to look for exoplanets, and they do it in a similar way. So the way we extract the light curve is we have to use Mathematica to divide up the image. And we use this by creating kind of a virtual bullseye here, where there's three interesting areas. The center red disk is where you put the star, and then this blue annulus measures the background brightness, and you subtract out the background brightness by counting up the pixel values. And that normalizes the star brightness to a constant value. And then by taking a series of images like this, you can get the light curve of the star as a function of time. So obviously we need to be able to measure the time. So we can easily create these annular masks using Mathematica's graphics capabilities. And then we basically count up the star values after the masks have been applied. And then finding out when the image was taken sometimes requires a little more work than you might think. FITS files tend to have in their metadata Julian dates, and Julian dates are ideal for doing this because they have, it's basically a floating point value which determines the actual number of days since January 1st, 4713 BC in the Julian calendar. So we can bring this data into Mathematica. And sometimes we have to do a little extra parsing to get an accurate value. And then by using this photometry function, we can get the brightness as a function of time. And this is a Cepheid example from the University of Iowa. There's the Cepheid right there. And these are reference stars that of known brightness that you can use to get the brightness of the Cepheid as a function of time. So the Cepheid is right there, and then by throwing that photometry function at the series of images with their intrinsic Julian dates, we can get the data, we can sort it and start it at the first Julian date, and then plot the results. And this shows the characteristic shark tooth form of a Cepheid variable. And by doing additional processing on this, you can determine the period of that, and that can be used to determine the star's intrinsic brightness and its distance from Earth. So finally, the last thing I want to talk about is actually using Mathematica to control your telescope. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. Luckily, there's standard libraries for interfacing to astronomical equipment like ASCOM or INDI. And you can write interfaces to these things using a number of different Mathematica technologies, from MathLink, which is now called WSTP, .NET-Link, or Wolfram's Library Link. However, you don't even need to do that. A lot of these telescope control protocols are done over a serial line, and Mathematica can just write stuff to a serial port. So if you know the protocol, it's pretty easy to control your scope. Give me an example. There's two very popular protocols. One's called the LX200 protocol. This is supported by Mead Astrophysics and Losmandy. Another one's called the NextStar protocol. We're going to talk about, they're similar but not the same. We're going to talk about the LX200 protocol briefly. So we just write some low-level functions here, which are based on things like device write and pause, and from character code device read. So this reads the result from the telescope, this writes the result to the telescope, and this just waits a while for the telescope to catch up. So if we use the in the LX200 protocol, the slew command is this :ms pound. So we can write that to the telescope. And now we can, and also this is the commands for setting a specific right ascension and declination target. And then you can, then slewing the scope to a given right ascension and declination is just a matter of parsing these strings and then feeding into these low-level functions that we've written. And this is an example. Here's M13, which is one of the largest globular clusters visible in the Northern Hemisphere. This is what its image looks like. We can just open the serial port. Here it's a USB TTY000, so it's just a USB port, 9600, 8, none, and 1. And feed that device into scope slew to RA-DEC and use the data from star cluster data to find the coordinates of M13. That will slew your scope right to M13, and then you just close it and the scope will be pointed there. And you can even take this a step further and build an entire, with a little creative carpentry, you can build an entire astronomical touchscreen computer out of a Raspberry Pi, which runs a free version of Mathematica. And you can take images from this in your scope and mount this whole thing on your mount. So that's the whole talk. Does anyone have any questions? And I'm right on time. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions, so you can send, you can chat, and I'll try to answer the stuff as best I can. Let's see here, hold on.
Looks like Michael Drops has a question. Any experience taking bias frames with the DSLR? Is a 1/1000th second exposure good enough?
No, with bias frames, I always set the camera to its fastest shutter speed. So when I take bias frames, I usually make them around 1/4000th of a second. If you have a faster shutter speed, I would recommend doing it at 8,000th of a second. So that will concentrate just on the read noise.
Another question in the Pathable chat. Have you ever tried the aligning and stacking for landscape astrophotography?
Landscape astrophotography? Not exactly sure. Oh, landscape astrophotography. Oh, I know what you're talking about. No, that is, okay, I know what you're talking about. That's where you take a long exposure photograph of the sky and then you illuminate the landscape with a high-powered flash unit to get like pictures of trees and stuff in there. I haven't ever tried that because I used to do that many years ago, but not anytime recently. So that's a good thing to try, but not yet.
Another question is, I think Google does segmentation on sky, not sky for that kind of thing. I apologize, that wasn't a question, it was a comment.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is you take a picture of a landscape maybe partially illuminated by the sun, and then you subtract out the sky, and then later on do another image of the sky and then kind of blend them together. Yeah, you can do that. I always see pictures like that, and I think there's a fair amount of manipulation going on there, so I kind of shy away from that, but it looks great. It looks great. Again, you want to get those are actually kind of easy to make because you don't have to worry about precisely tracking an object, since you're taking a picture of the whole sky. And you can take those sort of pictures without a telescope, just with a camera with a fairly wide angle lens, as long as you have a tracking mount that can track the sky over, 10 minutes or so.
Another question, could you establish a stream to a webcam and use the signal and Mathematica algorithms to control the microscope to follow an object like a guidance star? I assume they meant telescope.
Telescope. Yeah, you probably could. That requires a very tight feedback loop. I use a dedicated guiding software to do that. And I think that might be pushing it with Mathematica. I think the guiding corrections have to be made on on like a 1 second or a fraction of a second basis to get good exposures. And I don't think we could do that with a webcam and streaming to Mathematica. Let's see, actual question, does the alignment functionality you're using account for telescope movement and sky rotation, or are all the time scales not long enough to warrant that? For the video stacking, the telescope and sky rotation don't really matter because as long as your target remains in the field of view, which is not always easy because like with Mars, it's a tiny object, and the sensor I'm using is a tiny sensor. So just getting Mars onto that sensor is tricky, and if you're not lined up properly, it's going to crawl off the sensor after a minute or two. So you always have to kind of recenter it, but it can stay on there long enough to take one of these little video clips, which are typically 15 to 30 seconds. For long exposure stuff like the picture of M27, then you do have to very carefully align the telescope with the polar axis, and you have to use some sort of guiding. So I have a little scope mounted on top of my main telescope, which locks onto a star and feeds guiding corrections into the mount. And with that, and also some other techniques called periodic error correction, the scope can track for like 5 minutes and get a good subframe that way. Longer than that, it's kind of pushing it unless you do more fiddly alignment. But that's what you need to get a decent subframe for a long exposure thing. Yes, I'm going to share the notebook of the file. I will do that.
Looks like we have a little over 2 minutes for any other questions. So if anyone wants to write them in Pathable or raise their hand in the Zoom, and we can allow the questioner to talk.
Yes, if people want, I could set up a meeting so people can just ask me more questions if that's needed. We need a package repository for packaging up all this functionality. Very good question, Michael. I have a repo with all my astronomical software that I've written in the Wolfram language in there, including stuff like the image processing stuff and the photometry stuff. So you can check that out, and we can publish that. And I've been wanting to do that for a while. Would it be possible to create a panoramic shot with this technique and stitch? I'm thinking of the crater shot. Sure, you can do that. You could move the scope around and take quite a few pictures and stitch them together. That would be very easy to do. And probably easy to do with just a function call in Mathematica, because we have stitching routines. I'll have to take a look at that. Astrophotography with night sight on. Not sure what that is. Fine. I can. The next thing I'd like to try out is get this this Astro computer thing out and point it at Mars, maybe in the next couple days, and capture some video right onto that thing. And that little computer can run Mathematica, so I could do all the processing like right on the scope. So that'd be an interesting exercise in miniature processing there. Yeah, sure. These talks always turn into blog posts, and I've done a number of them, so I think it's probably time for me to do another one.
Looks like we have about 1 minute left. So if there are other questions, I just want to thank you all for coming, and thank you, Tom, for a fascinating talk.
Okay, very good. I'm glad that I got through it right on time, because I was worried that I had too much stuff and I wouldn't be able to get to everything.
It was right on the money. Probably the best timing I've seen all week.
Well, that's what rehearsal will do for you.
There you go. Thanks again. Thank you all for
Okay,
coming.
everyone. Thank you very much for attending the talk. And I hopefully will see you in person in the coming years. But right now, I think things are working out quite well.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, you too. Bye,
Bye-bye.
guys.